Hey everybody, this is the first of 4 videos on this 2004 Yamaha Kodiak 450. Today we'll be replacing the carburetor. Let's jump right in. This is a 2004 Yamaha Kodiak 450 carbureted. We're going to have to replace the choke handle on the handlebars. We're going to rebuild the carburetor. Also, we're going to replace the rear brake hand cable. Take the cover off the fuel tank. Takes a 10mm socket, and I believe it's a 4mm Allen or hex wrench. As always, you want some kind of bin, some Ziploc bags to keep your bolts in. That way nothing gets lost, even if you knock that bin over. If you're anything like me, the bin's going to get knocked over. Careful, especially if your bike's been outside a lot. This one has not. It's been outside a little bit. This plastic gets real brittle once it gets about 10 years old or so. I'm going to inspect the air filter. That could probably use replacing. It's swollen a little bit. I don't know if you can tell that or not. Probably not. Black on my black shirt. The tank has 4 10mm bolts, 2 at the back, 2 at the front. You'll have to remove your handle for your fuel pay-top. There's a Phillips screw all the way in the end. Probably have to put a little pressure on it to get your screwdriver to bite, because it's usually full of dirt and trash. Alright. I'm going to disconnect our fuel line from the carburetor. These back 2 bolts are fairly easy to get to. Probably need at least a 6-inch extension to get the front 2 bolts. The two front bolts will have a spacer. You want to make sure you get that out of there. So a bolt, a large washer, and a spacer. That spacer just keeps you from crushing the front piece of the tank. That's just a rubber grommet this goes through. But if you don't get it out of there, it's probably going to fall and you're probably not going to find it. Take this fuel tank outside and drain it. Alright, we've got the fuel tank draining into the waste gas barrel. There's some zip ties holding a piece of rubber here. We're going to cut those. We'll be using a pair of side cutters. This gets the carburetor exposed. Remove the airbox to remove the carburetor. So we're going to yank that out of there real quick. It's also two 10mm bolts, vacuum line, maybe a drain line on the bottom. Actually, the carburetor's gonna come out. There's the carburetor. So the carburetor has two cables going to it. On the left side is the choke. On the right side is the throttle. There's 3 screws to remove this cover, and underneath is an O-ring. There's a small brass fitting that fits over the end of the throttle cable and fits into a hole on the end of the throttle shaft. You may be able to get that out of there with your fingernails, or if not, I have used a small pair of pliers. Now over at the bench, there are 4 screws in the carburetor float bowl. You'll want to remove those. If they're too tight, you feel like you're going to strip them out, I have a impact screwdriver, and I may do a video on that later. That's the kind that you hit with a hammer and it gradually loosens the screw. But we'll take those 4 screws out, we'll pop the float bowl off. I'm using a pair of vice grips because the screw felt soft and I was afraid I'd strip it. Remove the screw securing the float and needle. Inspect the float for cracks or damage. Make sure there's no gas inside the float. Next, we're going to take all 3 jets out, starting with the main jet. You'll need a flat tip screwdriver. If we weren't replacing these jets, you need to use extreme caution not to bend or damage the jet as you take it out. Once you have those 3 jets out, you need to remove the old gasket if it's stuck to the mating surface of the carburetor. We'll then take out our air mixture screw, and if you watch closely, you'll catch I didn't turn it in to count how many turns before I took it out. It's usually 2 to 2.5. Then you can adjust it once you get it on the bike. Then we'll remove the emulsion tube. I believe this one was an 8mm. We're going to flip the carburetor over. We're going to take the 2 screws from the mixing chamber. When you remove this cover, it does have a spring underneath, so make sure you have your hand on top of it to keep it from taking off. Once you remove the cover, remove the spring, you'll remove the diaphragm. You'll inspect the rubber part of the diaphragm for tears or holes. Use a pair of needle nose or duckbill pliers to remove the piece that holds the needle. There is a small spring under there. Then you'll be able to turn this over. You'll be able to get your needle out. There'll be some washers with it as well. The rebuild kit we're using comes with a new needle seat as well, so we'll remove this screw. Then we'll use a pair of pliers to pull the old seat out. I have had to take a wood screw and screw it into the seat to pry it out before. This one comes out fairly easy. This carburetor is actually fairly clean inside, considering that we're having to rebuild it. Just take some carb cleaner, spray it in every hole in the carburetor. Every hole should lead to an exit somewhere. We're going to give this dude a pretty good bath. Spray it down. Don't be conservative with that carb cleaner. You can't use too much of it. There is another jet here. We'll remove it with a small flathead screwdriver. Go back and double check everything with carb cleaner. There is an accelerator pump on the side, has 2 screws, has a pretty strong spring behind it, so you'll need to keep your finger over it when you pop it loose. As you'll see, it gets away from me and I was ready for it. Luckily, I was able to find the spring and the cover. We're going to clean the cover. We're going to pull the diaphragm out. We're going to inspect it for tears or holes. Make sure it is pretty flexible and not stiff and crinkly. There's 2 or 3 holes under here we're going to hit with carb cleaner. Then we're going to put the diaphragm back in. There are 2 pegs that help you with the positioning. Then the spring will go on top of that, and then the cover, which will receive the 2 pegs. Make sure you don't get it backwards. Then we'll tighten the screws back up on it. After a look at comparing the kits there, we're going to compare the seats. We're going to install the O-ring, press the seat back down into the carburetor body with the handle of a screwdriver. You may have to give it a couple taps to get it down far enough. Then we're going to place the screw that holds the seat. This is the piece over the emulsion tube. It has a flat side. That side needs to go towards the emulsion tube. Place the O-ring on the emulsion tube, insert it, taking an 8mm wrench and tighten it down. Being careful not to squeeze the O-ring out. Then we're going to place the main jet with the cup that was around the old main jet. Place it in with a screwdriver. You don't have to over tighten these, just snug them or you will damage the jet. Now we'll take carb cleaner and spray out any trash. Now we'll put the air mixture screw back in. You'll place the spring, and then there's a washer. Then there's an O-ring that goes on. You'll need to dig the old ones out of the carburetor body using a pick. We're going to install the air mixture screw by lightly seating it into the proper hole. You'll take it all the way down until it lightly seats. You'll back it out 2 to 2.5 turns. Again, you can adjust this if the idle is not correct on the bike. Next, you'll compare the new and old float needle. You'll install the new needle onto the float. There's a metal tab that the float needle should slide right onto. After this, you'll install the fulcrum into the float. You'll then install the float by dropping the needle into the seat. The fulcrum should go into a groove. Then there should be a screw that you removed holding the float on. You replace that screw. Next, you're going to install the float bowl gasket. There's a groove around the top of the float bowl. You place the gasket in that groove. And then I found the easiest way is to hold the bowl upright and roll the carburetor onto the float bowl. Now you're going to replace your 4 float bowl screws. You should have taken note when you took them out which one had the holder for the idle speed adjuster. It will usually be the screw that will be the left front once the carburetor is installed in the proper position. Now we'll replace our bowl drain screw. Replace the small jet on the intake side of the carburetor. Now we'll replace the needle. There's a washer and a plastic spacer. Take those off. There'll then be a clip. You want to note what position that clip is in. This will determine how rich or lean your carburetor runs. Most stock settings are in the middle clip. The spring for the fucking. You want your YouTube debut to be you getting your ass whooped? Got it the first time and it was on video. Okay, we're going to replace the choke valve. First have to put the O-ring on the cap spring back. Pull the old valve off. Take the spring, the cap. You're replacing it with an all balls kit. List. There's also a rubber boot that goes on the top of the cap to seal it. Also have to put the O-ring on the starter valve. Slides down in the groove, feed the choke cable through. Just push. If you activate the choke and pull it back, it's a little bit easier to get in. Seat it down into the spring. Okay. Slide it in. Thread it down with your fingers. Careful not to strip the plastic threads. Take a 12mm wrench, tighten it. Being careful not to break the cap. It's actually why we're replacing it is because I broke it. The throttle housing. Before you get the carburetor all the way in, you want to put this cover back over the throttle housing. That will work the carburetor back into position.